6-foot Jow. My husband spit in my face in front of his mother and sister, and they clapped. I walked away without a word, but 5 minutes later, the house in Cape Haven seemed to shake when I made one call. The entire living room went silent. The warm wetness dripped down my chin as I heard their celebration, 3 women laughing like they had just watched the best movie ever. My mother-in-law, Matilda Whitmore, sat on her throne-like wicker chair with that mean smile I had grown to hate over the past 15 years. My sister-in-law, Sabrina, perched on the sofa, clapping her hands like a child at a circus show. And my husband, Graham Whitmore, the man I had cooked for and cleaned for through storms and sunshine, stood there looking at me as if I were a bug he wanted to crush. About time, Matilda said, her voice full of joy. Someone finally taught her a lesson. The fight had started over something so small I could hardly remember. Maybe dinner, maybe the new curtains for the bay window facing Harbor Street. Every day, everything I did was wrong in their eyes. I moved too slow, talked too much, spent too much money, didn't spend enough, breathed the wrong way. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button for stories of Auntie May 365. We want to know how many people hear our stories. But this time, when I tried to tell them how I felt, something I rarely did anymore, Graham walked right up to me and spit in my face. No angry words first, no warning, just pure hate made visible. The spit rolled down my cheek as I stood there unable to move. In 15 years of marriage, through all the mean words and cold shoulders that had become normal, nothing had prepared me for this moment. This wasn't anger. This was contempt so deep I no longer counted as human. "That's what happens when you don't listen," Sabrina said, inspecting her polished pink nails. "Maybe now she'll learn to keep quiet. Keep quiet." I almost laughed. They had no idea what I was really capable of. I didn't clean my face. I didn't cry. I didn't yell or hit back like any normal person might when her husband treats her like garbage before his family. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I smiled. Not happy, not sad, but the cold smile of someone who has finally realized the game is over. "You're right," I said softly. Voice calm, though my heart raced. Everyone should know where they belong. Graham looked confused. He was used to my tears, my sorries, my begging to make things right. For months, every fight had ended with me taking the blame, promising to be better. But that woman, the one who apologized for existing, who made herself smaller to please them, died the second his spit hit my face. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, feeling their eyes on my back. I could hear their whispers, probably planning the next cruel thing. They didn't know I had figured out their game months ago. In the kitchen, with the blue tile backsplash, I had chosen and they had mocked. I took out my phone with hands that did not shake. That surprised me. I thought they would tremble, that I would cry. Instead, I felt calmer than I had in years. I scrolled until I found the name I wanted. Lucas Hart. My little brother answered immediately. "It's time I said." "Are you sure?" His voice was soft but serious. We had prepared for this day. He spit in my face, Luke, right in front of his mother and sister. They cheered. The quiet on the line stretched long. Then Lucas spoke. Voice changed, cold, professional. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't say anything else to them. Don't explain, don't fight, don't say sorry. Just wait." "I've been waiting for 4 months, I whispered. "I know," he said, "and now it's over." I hung up and stood in my kitchen, the place where I'd made thousands of meals for people who saw me as their servant, where I'd cleaned up after parties I wasn't welcome at, where I'd swallowed my hurt so many times I'd forgotten my own voice. The house was very quiet now. No more whispers, no laughter, just silence and the tick of the lighthouse clock on the wall. I walked back toward the living room, and that's when I saw them. All 3 were in the hallway, faces white as sailcloth, staring at me as though they'd seen a ghost. Who did you call Graham's voice had lost all its earlier strength? I didn't answer. I simply walked past them to the picture window and looked out at Harbor Street. A blue sedan was already pulling into our driveway. Evelyn Matilda's voice was sharp now, frightened. "Who did you call?" I turned to face them, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the broken woman I had become, but the one who used to think and feel and defend herself. I called someone who knows exactly where everyone belongs, I said. The doorbell rang, the sound rolling through the house like thunder off the Cape. Graham, Matilda, and Sabrina looked toward the door, then back at me, then at one another. For the first time since I'd known them, they looked worried. The bell rang again, longer this time. "Aren't you going to answer it?" I asked sweetly. "It's your house, after all." Graham walked toward the door like a man heading to his own funeral. When he opened it, Lucas Hart stepped inside, briefcase in hand, wearing the steely expression that had made him one of the best divorce lawyers in the county. "Good evening," he said, voice cutting through the silence. "I'm Lucas Hart, representing Mrs. Evelyn Hart. I have papers that need your immediate attention." The change was instant. Matilda, so proud and venomous moments ago, seemed to shrink into herself. Sabrina's face went paper white. And Graham, my husband, who had humiliated me, who had spit in my face like I was nothing, looked as if he might vomit. Papers he managed. Lucas opened his bag deliberately. Divorce documents, a restraining order, and a few other items that I think will interest everyone here. He handed Graham a thick stack, then turned to Matilda and Sabrina, giving each her own set. "Ladies," he said with cold politeness, "you're also named in several of these filings." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kettle settle on the stove. This was the moment I had worked toward for 4 months, ever since I admitted my marriage wasn't merely broken. It was cruel. Not violent, though tonight had crossed that line, but mean in every other way. They had spent years tearing me down, making me question my worth, my sanity, my right to exist in spaces they claimed as theirs. What they didn't know was that for those same 4 months, I had been documenting everything, every insult, every trick, every decision made without me. I had recorded conversations, saved their messages, and built a case that ensured I would never again apologize for breathing. Lucas looked around the room with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just delivered the justice his client deserved. "Mrs. Hart," he said, turning to me, "shall we discuss when you'll move into your new place?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice yet. 4 months of planning secret meetings and meticulous notes, all leading to this. Behind me, I could hear Graham rifling through the pages, his breathing quick and panicked. Matilda clutched her papers as if they might vanish. Sabrina stared at hers, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. "There must be some mistake," Graham finally said, voice high and desperate. "Evelyn wouldn't. She couldn't." "Oh, but she did," Lucas replied smoothly. "Mrs. Hart has been very thorough in her planning. Everything is perfectly in order." I looked at the 3 people who had made my life miserable, who had convinced me I was worthless, who had cheered my humiliation only minutes earlier. They looked so small now, so powerless. And for the first time in years, I breathed freely. The hotel room smelled faintly of salt and linen, like the sea trying to forget what it once carried. I sat at the edge of the bed, watching the thin line of dawn stretch across the horizon outside my window. For the first time in 15 years, I woke up in a room where no one expected anything from me. No breakfast to cook, no footsteps pacing the hall waiting to criticize the way I breathed. Only quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest until you have to decide whether it's peace or emptiness. The divorce papers had been delivered, the restraining order signed. But peace, I was learning, doesn't arrive when the noise stops. It begins when the silence no longer terrifies you. I looked at my reflection in the dark mirror, a face I hadn't really seen in years. The woman staring back wasn't angry. She was tired. The kind of tired that sinks into the bones. Yet under that fatigue, there was a strange clarity, as if the ache itself had sharpened my sight. Pain, I realized, was a teacher, and mine had been whispering to me for a very long time. I just never listened. On the small desk beside the bed lay my phone. The screen glowed with unread messages from Graham. "Please talk to me. It's not what you think. We can fix this. I didn't open them. Every apology from him had been another rope tightening around my neck. Instead, I reached for the leather notebook I'd been keeping hidden for months, the one where I'd written down every cruel word, every manipulation, every quiet betrayal. The pages were wrinkled now, stained with tears that had dried into a kind of salt map. Each line was a piece of truth I had been too afraid to say out loud, and then I noticed something new on the floor near the door. A folded envelope, no hotel logo, no name, just slipped under like a secret. My first instinct was fear. I hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a single piece of stationery, handwritten in a woman's delicate script. You don't know me, but I knew him. He lied to you and to all of us. What happened to you wasn't an accident. It was practiced. If you want the full truth, meet me tonight at Pier 3 before sunset. There was no signature, only a smudge of perfume. I didn't recognize something floral too young for Matilda, too cheap for Sabrina. My heart tightened. It could be a trick. It could also be the one thing I'd been searching for proof that my pain wasn't madness. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside my notebook. For hours I stared at it, listening to the muted hum of the city below. My mind replayed every conversation, every humiliation, every moment I had excused Graham's cruelty as stress or family pressure. How many lies had I helped him tell simply by refusing to see the truth I realized isn't a thunderclap. It's a slow light that creeps into the room and shows you the dust that was always there. When Lucas called later that morning to check on me, I told him about the letter. He went quiet, then said in that lawyer voice he used, "When something didn't sit right, Evelyn, this could be important or dangerous. But it sounds like someone else knows what you went through." "I'm not sure I can face more truth, Luke," I admitted. "Every time I learn something new, it breaks me a little more. Maybe breaking is what's saving you," he said softly. "You can't rebuild what you refuse to see." After we hung up, I opened the window. The air smelled of rain and salt, Cape Haven's familiar mixture of healing and decay. Down below, people were walking their dogs, buying coffee, living normal lives. For years, I'd envied those people, the ones whose mornings weren't built on fear. Now I realized normal life isn't something that happens to you. It's something you reclaim, piece by fragile piece. At noon, the hotel staff brought a tray of soup I didn't order. The note attached read, "From management, we're glad you're feeling better." I wondered if Lucas had called them quietly, looking out for me the way he always did when we were kids. By late afternoon, I finally made up my mind. I would go to the pier not for revenge, not for curiosity, but because I needed to understand how deep the deception truly went. The sun hung low when I arrived at Pier 3. Fishermen were packing their nets. Seagulls screamed overhead. And then I saw her, a woman in a gray coat, hair the color of wet sand, standing by the rail. She turned as I approached. "Mrs. Hart." Her voice trembled slightly. "Yes," I said. "Who are you?" "My name is Clara Benton," she said. "I worked at the accounting firm." "With your husband." I felt my throat tighten. She hesitated, glancing around. "I shouldn't even be talking to you, but I couldn't sleep after I heard what happened. He made me do things I didn't understand at the time, adjusting records, hiding transactions in other accounts. I thought it was routine, but later I realized he was covering payments for women." Her words hit me like the first cold wave of winter. "For women," she nodded. "He had a system. Gifts, rent, money, transfers. You weren't the only one he controlled, Mrs. Hart. There were others. Some of them thought they loved him. Some were afraid. All of them were trapped." The wind howled through the pier rails. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I had suspected infidelity, but not an entire architecture of manipulation. Clara continued quietly, "I know you've already filed for divorce, but there's more. Matilda and Sabrina. They knew. They instructed him how to keep everything hidden. I have copies of the internal memos he sent. I've been holding on to them, afraid to come forward." "Why now?" I asked. She looked me in the eye, and for the first time I saw not guilt, but empathy. Because you stood up. When I saw the news about the restraining order, it gave me courage. I thought, maybe this time the truth will matter. I didn't cry. I simply nodded. There were no tears left, only the steady heartbeat of understanding. When I returned to the hotel that night, the city lights shimmered against the window like scattered promises. I placed Clara's documents next to the letter she'd sent, and my own notebook, 3 different voices, one shared wound. For the first time, I felt the outline of something larger than my marriage. This wasn't just my story. It was a map of harm passed from one woman to another, each trying to survive in silence. Pain, I realized, can destroy, but it can also reveal. It forces you to look at what you once begged to ignore. It strips away illusion until all that remains is truth. I turned off the light and sat in the dark, the ocean murmuring beyond the glass. Somewhere inside me, the anger had burned itself out, leaving only the faint glow of awareness, not peace, yet but the beginning of it. And for the first time in years, I whispered to the darkness, I see it now, all of it. If you were Evelyn standing in that quiet hotel room, holding proof of years of deception, would you go deeper into the truth or turn away to start over press 0 for let it rest, or 1 for find the whole truth? The next morning arrived pale and uncertain, like the world itself was afraid to wake. Evelyn sat by the window, the gray Cape Haven lights spilling across her hands. The letter from Clara still lay open on the table beside the evidence copies of memos, payment records, fragments of conversations printed on cheap office paper. Each page was a blade, sharp, cold, and necessary. She had read them all through the night. By dawn, she wasn't crying. She was planning. Courage, she realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, "Get up and keep going." The fear never left. It sat behind her ribs like a second heartbeat, but beneath it was something stronger, a quiet, steady belief that truth mattered. She no longer wanted to hurt anyone. She only wanted the shadows gone. Lucas called mid-morning. "I've reviewed the files you sent," he said. "Clara's documents are real, but if we're going to use them, we need to verify the originals, company archives, timestamps, chain of custody. Otherwise, Graham's lawyers will call it fabrication. So I'll get them," she replied before thinking. "Evelyn, that's not your job. We can subpoena those." She hesitated. "Subpoenas take weeks, Luke, and you know him. By then everything will disappear. They'll shred, wipe, and vanish like they always do." A long pause. Then in the voice of a brother who knew exactly who his sister had become, he said, "If you're going to do this, do it carefully." That evening, Evelyn drove to the old Whitmore and Pierce accounting building. The lot was empty, the windows dark except for the soft security glow. She still remembered the access code Graham had bragged about. His arrogance had always been his weakness. The keypad beeped once, then the door clicked open. The smell of paper and ink hit her like memory itself. She walked slowly through the hall, her heels soft against the carpet. Every sound was magnified, the hum of a fluorescent light, the ticking clock, her own shallow breath. She found the records room. Cabinets lined the walls like sentinels guarding secrets. It felt almost sacred, a chapel of deception, built from years of false numbers and quiet crimes. Her hands trembled as she opened a drawer labeled Private Accounts, 2018. Inside, rows of manila folders glowed under the weak light. Tessa Marlowe, Adrienne Cole, June Bennett. The names she'd seen before now, neatly coded and categorized under Graham's handwriting. Evelyn took photos with her phone page after page until her hands stopped shaking. Each image was a heartbeat of justice. Then she froze. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. She turned off the light and held her breath. The footsteps stopped near the doorway. "Who's there?" a man's voice called, firm alert. Her pulse raced. A security guard. She recognized him faintly from the holiday parties, Harold, the quiet janitor who'd once told her he liked her lemon bars. She stepped out of the shadows. "It's just me, Harold. Evelyn Whitmore." His eyes widened. Mrs. Whitmore. "I thought I know," she said gently. "I'm not supposed to be here." He looked at her for a long moment, then at the files in her hands. Something softened in his expression. "You're getting your life back, aren't you?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Then you didn't see me." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Thank you." He stepped aside, and she slipped past him into the night air. The cool wind off the bay hit her face like a baptism. She drove back to the hotel with her pulse pounding her phone heavy with proof. That night, she uploaded the files to Lucas's encrypted server. For a moment, the progress bar glowed on the screen like a tiny lighthouse in the dark. When it finished, she closed the laptop and sat back. There was no victory, no thrill. Only the steady, trembling calm of someone who has finally done the right thing no matter the cost. Later, as she made tea, she thought about all the stories she'd heard online, the ones people called Reddit revenge stories. Tales of women and men reclaiming dignity after years of cruelty. But this, she thought, wasn't revenge. It was survival. It was truth claiming its voice. Still, she understood why people watched those stories late at night, because they needed to believe that pain could turn into justice, that endurance could become strength. She whispered to herself, "Maybe mine will be one of those Reddit revenge stories one day, not because I want fame, but because someone out there needs to hear it." Outside rain began to fall, soft, steady cleansing. Evelyn wrapped herself in the hotel blanket and watched the droplets chase each other down the window pane. She thought of Clara, of Harold, of all the small kindnesses that had carried her this far. Courage, she decided, isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else, truth, dignity, light, is more important than fear. By morning, the local paper carried a headline that made her heart skip. Anonymous whistleblower leaks fraud records from Whitmore and Pierce. Lucas called within minutes. "It's out. Someone leaked everything the bank transfers, the hidden accounts." This just blew open the entire case. Evelyn stared at the headline, her tea cooling in her hands. "It wasn't me," she said quietly. "Clara," maybe Lucas said, or someone else inside. "Either way, this changes everything. Graham's entire operation is under investigation. You just started a storm." The words should have frightened her. But they didn't. For the first time in years, she felt steady. Not happy, that would come later, but solid, like the ground had finally stopped shifting beneath her feet. That evening, she walked along the Cape Haven pier again. The sea was rough waves crashing against the rocks with angry grace. She watched the water for a long time, thinking of all the years she'd stayed silent. Each wave felt like a heartbeat, each crash a whisper, "You made it through." She knew the days ahead would be hard. Court hearings, media noise, maybe even retaliation. But fear was no longer her master. In her quiet way, she smiled. "They think they've started the storm," she murmured. "But I'm the one who called the wind." The gulls scattered as thunder rolled across the bay. She turned back toward the lights of the town, her reflection trailing across puddles like a ghost, finally leaving the world that made her. Somewhere in that calm, she knew this wasn't the end of the story, just another chapter in what the world might one day call Reddit revenge stories. And maybe, just maybe when others heard it, they'd remember her not as a victim, but as the woman who chose silence, then broke it. The days that followed the investigation were strange ones, half storm, half silence. Reporters called lawyers, met statements were drafted, but Evelyn stayed quiet. She moved through her small Cape Haven house like someone learning to breathe again. Every sound felt new, the creak of floorboards, the kettle's whistle, the distant cry of seagulls over the bay. Freedom, she realized, wasn't loud. It was the quiet that came after the shouting stopped. Graham hadn't tried to contact her in weeks. His lawyers had. His sister Sabrina, too. A single text that read, "Please think of the family." Evelyn had deleted it without replying. Family. The word had become too heavy, too stained with manipulation to mean what it once did. One gray afternoon, she returned to the old house to retrieve some personal items. The key still fit, though the air inside felt stale as if time itself had stopped the moment she left. She moved slowly through each room, the parlor, the kitchen, the study, touching things, not for sentiment, but for closure. On the piano bench, she found something unexpected, a sealed envelope tucked under the cushion. Her name written in Graham's handwriting, careful, familiar, almost tender. For a long time, she couldn't bring herself to open it. When she finally did, the letter began simply, Evelyn. If you're reading this, it means I've failed to say things I should have said while you were still listening. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I was raised in a house where love and control were the same thing. My mother taught me that power meant protection, that weakness was the same as betrayal. I passed that poison on to you, and I see that now. You deserved more than the man I became. Her eyes blurred. The letter continued half confession, half plea, describing his fears, his emptiness, the way Helen's approval had shaped his cruelty. It didn't excuse him, but it explained him, and that made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time, Evelyn didn't feel anger. She felt grief not for the marriage that had ended, but for the love that could have been if only they'd both been braver. She folded the letter, placed it back inside the piano, and whispered, "Goodbye, Graham." That evening, she walked to the pier. The wind carried the salt smell of the sea, and the sun slipped behind the horizon like an ember fading out. Lucas called while she stood there, his voice gentle. "They've offered a settlement," he said. "It's good fare. You'll keep your share. The foundation gets additional funding, and he'll sign an official apology." "An apology?" "Yes. Public and written." She hesitated. "Will it change anything?" "No," Lucas said softly. "But maybe it'll help close a door." She thanked him and ended the call. The next morning, Graham appeared at her door. Not the polished man she remembered, not the arrogant husband who believed himself untouchable, but a hollow, tired version. His hair was unkempt, his suit wrinkled. There were dark circles beneath his eyes. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "please, just 5 minutes." She considered closing the door, but something in his voice, not entitlement, not command, just the faint sound of a man drowning, made her step aside. He entered cautiously, as though the air itself might reject him. His eyes swept the small living room, landing on the framed photo of her parents, the potted orchid near the window. "You look peaceful," he said finally. "I am," she replied. He nodded slowly. "I heard about the foundation. You've done something good, something I never had the courage to do." Evelyn stayed silent. He sat on the edge of the chair, twisting his hands. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just need you to know that I see it now, all of it. The lies, the arrogance, the way I let my mother turn me into her reflection. I wish I could undo it." She studied his face, the tremor in his jaw, the despair hiding behind his composure. Once she would have rushed to comfort him, but that woman no longer existed. "I don't hate you, Graham," she said softly. "That's what surprises me most. I just don't feel anything anymore." His eyes widened, and for the first time in their long history, she saw fear not of losing her, but of facing himself. "I was broken before you ever met me," he whispered. "And I kept trying to fix you," she answered. "That was my mistake." They sat in silence. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Finally, she stood. "I read your letter," she said. His eyes flickered. "You found it, yes. It was honest and painful, but it doesn't change what happened." He nodded slowly, as though each movement cost him effort. "I didn't write it to change anything. I just needed to say it before there was nothing left to say." Evelyn walked to the window, her reflection merging with his in the glass. Two ghosts of what might have been. "I forgive you," she said at last. "But not for you, for me." The words hung in the room like incense, soft, invisible, and holy. Graham covered his face with his hands. "I don't know how to live with what I've done." Then start by not repeating it, she replied. He stood shoulders slumped. Goodbye, Evelyn. When the door closed, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything she had carried and was finally ready to set down. She sank into her chair and let out a breath that had been trapped inside her for 15 years. Outside, the ocean moved in rhythm with her heartbeat, slow, steady, endless. Forgiveness, she thought, isn't a gift for the other person. It's the key that unlocks your own cage. Later that week, she recorded her experience for the Foundation's first podcast episode. The microphone captured her voice steady and calm as she spoke not about revenge, but about renewal. There's a strange kind of peace that comes after truth, she said into the microphone. It doesn't erase the past. It simply gives you permission to stop living there. The episode went viral, shared widely under a thread titled Reddit Family Tales. Thousands of listeners wrote comments, some about their own toxic families, others about forgiveness that came too late. Evelyn read each message with quiet awe. When she spoke again the following week, she began with a smile. This isn't just another of those Reddit family tales about revenge or pain. It's about what happens when we stop fighting the storm and learn to stand still in it. By then, Graham had signed the apology. The Foundation had doubled its outreach, and Evelyn had become a quiet symbol of dignity reborn. She still kept the letter in the piano, not as proof of guilt, but as a relic of transformation. Sometimes, on rainy days, she would sit at the piano and play a single note. The one he always said reminded him of home. It no longer hurt. It just echoed soft, clean forgiving, like breath after a long cry. The weeks after Graham's departure were strangely peaceful. Evelyn filled her days with work for the Foundation reading case reports, answering letters from women who had lived her story in different forms. Each letter carried a familiar echo control, disguised as love, cruelty, disguised as care. She read them all with patience, sometimes with tears. But one morning, an envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a single brass key and a short note written in a tight, elegant hand. For when you're ready to know the truth. Helen. Her chest tightened. The handwriting was unmistakable, cold, perfect, and eerily composed. For several hours, she sat staring at the key, wondering if this was another manipulation. Helen was in prison serving time for fraud and conspiracy, yet somehow her influence still reached through the bars. Lucas warned her not to go. She's trying to keep control, Evie. Don't give her that. But curiosity, the quiet kind that blooms from unfinished pain, pulled stronger than caution. That evening, Evelyn drove to the old Whitmore estate. The property had been sealed for investigation, but the gate still bore the family crest, two silver lions facing each other, proud, tired, and cruel. The key fit an antique drawer in Helen's private study. Inside were papers, letters, and a small leather-bound journal. The first page was dated 1959. June 3rd, 1959, Mother says affection makes men weak. She says if I want to be respected, I must never cry in front of Father. She says power is love, and love is obedience. I believe her, though I don't like the way it feels. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. Entry after entry unfolded a history of emotional brutality. Helen's mother, Graham's grandmother, had ruled her family through fear and guilt. When Helen was a girl, she'd been trained to equate tenderness with danger. Father left when I was 12. Mother said he was weak. She smiled as she said it. I didn't understand why that made her happy. I promised myself I'd never be that weak, never love someone so much they could leave me. The handwriting grew steadier with age, the tone harder. Graham is 5 now. He flinches when I raise my voice. I must teach him not to. Weakness cannot survive in this world. Better he learns from me than from someone who'll break him for real. Evelyn had to stop reading. Her hands covered her mouth as tears welled up. Not for Helen, not even for Graham, but for the cycle itself. Generation after generation teaching that power was safety, that control was love. She whispered into the empty room. It never ended, did it? The next entries were worse detailed notes about conditioning her son, instructing him how to read people, how to turn emotion into leverage. One passage froze her completely. When Evelyn came into his life, I feared she'd ruin my work. But she's perfect, too kind, too trusting. She will make him strong by breaking herself. The best kind of training is the one that looks like devotion. Evelyn closed the journal, pressing it to her chest. Her breath came shallow and slow. The horror wasn't just in the cruelty, it was in the sincerity. Helen truly believed she was protecting her son. That night, Evelyn sat by the fireplace of her small house in Cape Haven, the journal beside her like a ghost. The flicker of the flames made the ink shimmer, as if the words were alive. She thought of Helen in her cell, still proud, still convinced she'd done nothing wrong. And suddenly Evelyn's anger dissolved into something else, something heavier and quieter. Pity. Pity for the child Helen had once been raised without softness. Pity for the boy Graham had been molded into a mirror of fear. Pain passed down like inheritance. Love twisted into armor. The next day, Evelyn brought the journal to Lucas. He read in silence, his face hardening with each page. This explains everything he said finally. The cruelty, the control. It wasn't just learned, it was engineered. Evelyn nodded. It doesn't excuse it, Luke, but it makes sense now. Lucas sighed. You're not thinking of visiting her, are you? I am, she said. He shook his head. You don't owe her anything. I know, Evelyn replied softly. But maybe I owe myself the truth. The prison smelled of metal and disinfectant. When Helen entered the visitation room, she looked older, smaller somehow, though her eyes still carried the glint of calculation. I didn't expect you to come, Helen said, sitting gracefully, even in a beige uniform. I read your journal, Evelyn said. Helen's lips tightened. So that's what you wanted the key for. I wanted to understand, Evelyn replied. Helen leaned back, studying her like a scientist examining an insect. And did you? Yes. Evelyn said quietly. I understand that you've spent your entire life mistaking control for care. You were taught that love is dangerous, so you turned it into a weapon. Helen's expression flickered just for a second before settling back into indifference. We all do what we must to survive. No, Evelyn said. We all do what we choose. For the first time, Helen didn't have an answer. They sat in silence for a long time. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space between them. Evelyn finally stood. I came here to tell you that I forgive you, she said. Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry your poison any longer. Helen blinked, caught off guard. You think forgiveness will make you better than me? No, Evelyn said. It just means I won't be you. As she walked out, she heard Helen whisper something she almost missed. I loved him, you know. Evelyn didn't turn around. So did I, she said. And that's why I had to let him go. That night, Evelyn recorded another message for the Foundation's archive, her voice low, thoughtful. We think evil is loud, she said, but most of the time it's quiet. It's a mother teaching her son that kindness is weakness. It's a woman believing cruelty keeps her safe. It's generations forgetting how to love without fear. The next morning, donations to the Foundation tripled. The podcast episode was shared across forums, including one thread titled Reddit Family Tales, Cycles of Control. In the comments, hundreds of listeners confessed that they too had been raised on versions of that same lie. As she read their words, Evelyn felt the ache deepen, not despair, but a kind of sacred sadness. She finally understood her story was never just hers. It was part of something older, wider. A map of pain handed down through time, waiting for someone to break the pattern. She closed her laptop, looked out at the sea, and whispered, It ends here. The morning light touched her face like grace, soft, forgiving, and finally free. Spring returned to Cape Haven slowly that year, as if the earth itself was cautious about hope. The last frost melted into soft rain, and the garden behind Evelyn's house began to bloom again, White lilies, her late mother's favorite, pushed through the soil, stubborn and bright. It had been almost 6 months since her visit to Helen in prison. The journal lay now in a sealed box kept not as a wound, but as proof of how far she had come. Evelyn no longer dreamed of confrontation or closure. She dreamed of voices, dozens of them telling the truth without shame. The Wilson Awareness Foundation had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. What began as a quiet support network had become a national platform. Women from all over the country wrote to share their stories: teachers, nurses, mothers, daughters. Some had escaped toxic marriages, others were still trying to find the courage to leave. Evelyn read every message, replying personally when she could, but it was a letter from a woman in Montana that gave her a new idea. "We listen to your podcast every Sunday," the woman had written. "We all sit together, a small circle of 6 women who survived the same man. Your voice gives us strength, but what we really want is to meet others like us, to remind ourselves we're not crazy and we're not alone." That single letter lit something inside Evelyn. Within weeks, she began planning what she called the Gathering of Truth, a retreat for survivors of psychological manipulation, hosted in Cape Haven. Lucas wasn't sure it was wise. "Evie, you're not a therapist," he said gently. "You can't carry everyone's trauma." "I don't need to," she replied. "I just want to give them a place to breathe." The retreat took place in late April in a renovated lighthouse overlooking the ocean. 24 women arrived, strangers at first, carrying quiet scars behind polite smiles. The wind that first morning was brisk, sweeping through the grass with a sound like whispered prayer. Evelyn stood before them in the main hall, her heart beating fast. "This isn't about revenge or shame," she said softly. "This is about reclaiming our voices, one story at a time." The room fell into a deep listening silence. They began with introductions, each name a story waiting to be told. There was Darla, who'd spent 20 years believing her husband's cruelty was just stress. Nadia, a young teacher, whose mother had convinced her that independence was selfishness. Lydia, an elegant widow who hadn't spoken of her pain in decades. As the hours passed, walls began to crumble. The women laughed, cried, and sometimes simply held each other's hands when words were too heavy. Evelyn moved among them quietly, less a leader than a witness. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, they gathered around a fire pit outside. Someone began humming an old folk tune. Another woman joined in, then another, until the sound became a fragile choir under the stars. Evelyn watched the faces glowing in the firelight, faces that had once been haunted but were now illuminated by something softer, something alive. This, she thought, is what healing looks like. Later that night, as she locked up the hall, she found Lydia sitting alone by the window. The older woman smiled faintly. "You know, she said, I used to think forgiveness meant weakness, but listening to these women, it feels like strength." Evelyn nodded. "It is strength, just the quiet kind." Lydia reached into her bag and handed her a photograph. "That's my daughter," she said. "We haven't spoken in 10 years. I think I'll call her when I get home." Evelyn looked at the photo, a young woman with the same soft eyes. "She'll answer," she said gently, "even if it takes time." On the second day, they held what Evelyn called the Circle of Names. Each woman was invited to write the name of the person who had hurt her, and then beneath it, the name of someone who had helped her heal. The papers were placed in a bowl, and one by one, they were burned in the fire. The flames rose, hissing and alive, carrying their pain into the cold sea air. Evelyn added her own paper last. Graham Whitmore, the man who had taught her the cost of silence. Lucas Hart, the brother who had taught her the power of truth. As the smoke drifted upward, Evelyn whispered a prayer she didn't know she still remembered. Let what was taken return as light. Afterward, they sat quietly watching the ashes settle. There were no speeches, no applause, just the sound of waves breaking against the rocks and the distant cry of gulls. In that moment, she felt something move inside her, a release gentle and deep. For years, she'd been surviving, Now she was living. The final morning brought an unexpected visitor. As the women were packing, Lucas arrived with a small film crew from a local network. They want to cover the retreat, he said, a piece about resilience and recovery. Evelyn hesitated. I don't want this to turn into spectacle. It won't, Lucas promised. They'll tell it right through your words. The camera rolled as Evelyn stood once more before the circle of women. When I first told my story, she began, I thought it was about loss. But now I know it was about finding people who understand. Pain isolates us, but sharing it builds a bridge. Behind her, the ocean shimmered in morning light, calm after a long storm. Later that evening, the news segment aired nationwide. Viewers saw the lighthouse, the laughter, the tears, the fire circle. Emails flooded in by the thousands. Counselors, teachers, and social workers reached out asking how to replicate the program in their towns. The story spread far beyond Cape Haven, a movement born not from outrage, but from grace. That night, Evelyn and Lucas sat by the shore listening to the surf. The air was cool, filled with the smell of salt and beginnings. You did it, Lucas said quietly. No, Evelyn replied with a smile. We did it. Every woman who spoke today, she did it. He looked at her, pride softening his eyes. Mom would have loved this. Evelyn nodded. She would have. She always said healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering differently. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last of the sun fade into gold. Evelyn felt the warmth spread through her chest, not excitement, not relief, but something gentler, belonging. After all the darkness she'd faced, she was finally part of something good, something that mattered. As the tide rolled in, she whispered, "We were broken, but not destroyed. And that's enough." The waves answered softly as if the whole sea agreed. Summer came early that year. Cape Haven glowed under long golden days, the kind that made even broken things look whole again. Evelyn often woke before sunrise, sitting on her porch with a cup of tea and listening to the gulls call across the bay. For the first time in years, her life moved without urgency. The court cases were over. The Wilson Foundation had become self-sustaining, now led by a team of volunteers who had once been survivors themselves. The house she'd bought by the sea was small, filled with light, and always smelled faintly of jasmine. Sometimes people expected her to feel victorious, as if justice had erased the pain. But Evelyn understood something deeper. Peace wasn't a medal you won. It was a quiet decision you made every day. She had walked through fire, and she carried the warmth, not the burn. One morning, she received an envelope from the state penitentiary. The return address was familiar. Helen Whitmore. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in precise handwriting. Evelyn, I've been listening to your foundation's broadcasts from the prison library. The women here talk about you like you're a saint. I don't know if you realize what you've started. Graham writes me sometimes. He says you visit the lighthouse often. That's good. It was always meant for light. I don't expect forgiveness. But I thought you should know my mother taught me fear. I taught my son control. You taught me consequence. Maybe that's how healing works, one generation at a time. Be well, Helen. Evelyn folded the letter and looked out toward the water. For the first time, she didn't feel the old tightening in her chest. There was only a deep, quiet empathy, not for the harm, but for the brokenness behind it. People hurt others when they can't bear their own reflection, she thought. Maybe Helen had finally begun to look in the mirror. That evening, Evelyn visited the lighthouse again. The gathering hall had become a community center, now a place for workshops, support meetings, and art therapy. On the walls hung paintings made by the retreat attendees, abstract bursts of color, landscapes of hope and faces, drawn with trembling courage. One painting stopped her completely, a portrait of a woman standing in the rain, her palms open to the sky. Underneath, someone had written, "Freedom doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers." Evelyn smiled. That was exactly how she felt. Free, but softly. Later that week, she hosted a quiet dinner for the original women from the retreat, Lydia, Darla, Nadia, and the others. They gathered around her long oak table, sharing food laughter and the kind of ease that comes only after surviving something hard together. As they ate, Darla raised her glass.